Hello everybody, this is the third in a series of 3 videos I'm doing about modern 3D platformers. I was planning to release this video last, but because of a hardware issue I need to re-record a lot of my ukulele footage. But I also wanted to quickly take the opportunity to tell all the subscribers that have been asking me to do so that I have made a Patreon for if it's something that you're interested in. But anyways, this show is called Fix That For You, where we will break down games, genres, and topics from a design perspective, sort out the pros and cons, and propose practical ways to solve any problems. Practical in this case meaning that any of these solutions could be implemented via a single patch, via DLC, or at worst, via a sequel. Today we're going to be talking about the Crash Bandicoot Remaster, covering all 3 games in the collection. You may be wondering what's the point of covering this collection, as it's essentially a 20-year-old set of games, but there are a few key features of the games as they were made 20 years ago that are important to discuss as they relate to 3D platformers now and going forward. And there are even a few tweaks and new features that also warrant discussion, as they change the balance, replay value, and overall package of these 3 games in a considerable way. Anyways, let's get started. Crash Bandicoot is one of the earliest progenitors of the 3D platforming genre. There were a few attempts at this genre from other games like Jumping Flash, Bug, and Fade to Black, but Crash Bandicoot and Mario 64 were the first real mainstream examples in the genre. Crash was conceived of as a direct competitor to Mario and was sold to Sony as a prospective mascot really from the very beginning. Now, Crash is distinct from the other 3D platformers of its time for a few reasons, and these are the same reasons and features that ensure it still holds up today. Why a graphical spitshine on a 20-year-old game can put it in the same company as modern games of the same type, and how this 20-year-old set of games can be the highest-selling single-format game of the year. The first of these features is cameras are virtually always an issue in 3D platformers. I covered this a little in the Mirror's Edge video, but cameras in 3D platformers were always a massive source of trouble and of friction. At the time Crash Bandicoot was developed, there really was no tried and true method for implementing a functional camera into a game like this, and dual analog sticks were still a few years down the road, so the game designers of the time had to devise their own solutions. Generally, 3D platformers of the time used some sort of low-precision rotational camera, generally controlled by shoulder or face buttons, but rather than do that, the team at Naughty Dog just decided to pull camera control away from the player entirely and put it on rails. This necessitated a specifically linear level design, but ultimately did wonders for the game's overall accessibility. Without the camera to contend with, the player could focus squarely on their locomotion, the timing of their movements, and the recognition of patterns, all of which made Crash Bandicoot a much more immediately satisfying experience than a lot of the progenitors of the genre that came before it. This drew a lot of flack at the time, and even still now, as it was a much more restrictive approach than Mario 64. Now the answer as to which of these approaches is better is more about opinion than fact, as I talked about in my crappy old Crash 2 versus Mario 64 video. But I think it's fair to say regardless about which approach you enjoy more, the merits of the on-rails camera system are fairly plain to see. The camera, however, is just the catalyst for the game's most important feature, and that feature is... if for some reason you have some masochistic, self-loathing reason and you wanted to stop by a mainstream game review site, you might see linear used as some sort of bald-faced insult. The insinuation being that linear design is somehow an outright bad thing. This of course is not the case, but the reason linear design is not a bad thing is not immediately apparent generally, so I'll explain a little bit. Open-ended design can make for a really interesting game, but the more open something is, the less focused it is. Keeping a game focused and keeping the design in a position where it is serving the main gameplay loop is unbelievably important. Crash does this in a number of ways, but the most important and demonstrable examples can be found directly in the level design. Levels in Crash 1, 2, and 3 are essentially very long corridors, which changes the way the player interacts with the levels themselves. This puts a focus on forward momentum, and forward momentum is the key difference between Crash and other 3D platformers that are its contemporaries. Crash was conceived by its creators as a sort of 3D hybrid of Sonic and Donkey Kong Country. The working title of the game was even the Sonic's Ass Game, fittingly enough, I guess. These inspirations are clear in all of the original Crash titles, but Crash 1 really snaps it into focus and carries the most obvious parallels as the art style and overworld almost exactly resemble those of Donkey Kong Country. That little bit of history may seem like an irrelevant, stupid tidbit, but in reality that information gives a direct insight into what Crash Bandicoot was essentially designed as, which is a 2D platformer, but in the third dimension. This focused design means that there is generally only one way to complete any given level, and that one way is to move forward. There are secret paths and alternate routes as well, but these alternate routes are themselves just another corridor branching off of the previous one. If you're having trouble visualizing what's different about this from other games of the same ilk, let me try to illustrate it for you. Games like Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie have levels that are essentially like maps. They take the shape of a circle or a square or whatever, and the ultimate end goal of the level can vary. You may be working your way to the center or the top, to a side, or to the back, where in Crash, levels are essentially always in the shape of a very long rectangle, with the start always at one end and the finish always on the other. This tells the player the most important information they need from the moment they start a level, and that information is, how do I progress? You may need to run toward the camera, or you may need to run away from it. You may even need to run to the side, but regardless of which direction you need to travel, the player can be assured of the way to progress. This in turn makes the game less about exploring and more about individual exercise of skill, which may or may not be a bad thing depending on the type of games that you like. But ultimately, I think for most players, the answer would be it is neither good or bad. This focused design in turn makes Crash just a completely different beast from the usual fare altogether. The accessibility of these systems does, however, have a limit on the expression of the game, which leads us to our first con. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, the concept of the skill ceiling is something that's been talked about pretty much to death. But just to give a quick definition, the skill ceiling describes the maximum degree of skill or ability that a game can accommodate from a player, while the skill floor does the opposite. That describes the least amount of skill a player can exhibit while still being successful in a given task or game. So, as awesome as it is that Crash Bandicoot's defining features lower the skill floor and make the game more accessible, unfortunately they also lower the skill ceiling and put a sort of soft cap on the degree of skill that the average player can express. The linear level design, grid-type movement, and limited moveset of the game are primarily responsible for this, as most actions only require a player to progress in one given direction at a time. You may go forward past an enemy, or to the side over a hazard, or away from an obstacle chasing you, but ultimately, you are still only having to progress in one direction, with all the limits that entails. This is in stark contrast to a game like Super Mario Sunshine or even Mario 64, where a player regularly has to move in any number of directions in order to fully clear an area, or even just to take down an enemy. But in order to balance for this linear design, Crash needed a limited moveset in order to remain challenging throughout. If Crash just had a toolbox of moves that could solve any given issue, there would be no challenge to be had in the platforming, which is why in the Crash games, the less moves you have at your disposal, the more difficult the game generally is. This is something, however, that the developers changed with Crash's sequels. Crash Bandicoot 2 added slide, slide jump, and crouch jump, and inadvertently the slide spin jump. These moves allowed for an increased control vocabulary, and they raised the skill ceiling while also not raising the skill floor. This is the best case scenario, but Crash 3 on the other hand went way too far in the other direction, adding a double jump and a slowing descent move, allowing you to tackle higher than usual obstacles and coast across long gaps with little to no exercise of any additional skill. This removes a lot of the challenge of the general platforming, and while there are additional enemies and hazards that occasionally take advantage of and force the use of these moves, there's not enough done in the game's actual design to warrant maneuvers that can ultimately trivialize a lot of the game's obstacles. This easier platforming caused the developers to look for other ways to challenge the player, namely in diversifying the types of levels in the game. And we call these types of levels...
You know, there's nothing wrong with diverse gameplay. Variety is the spice of life, or whatever, right? But Crash 3 goes a bit too far in its pursuit of this level diversification. So, the first two Crash Bandicoot games essentially had two types of levels. You had standard platforming levels, and you had auto-scrollers, which you're on the back of an animal or you're being chased by a hazard in. Crash 3, on the other hand, adds in several other types of levels, none of which are as enjoyable or as deep systemically as the standard platforming. Crash 3 adds underwater levels, which I literally have never met a single person in my entire life who enjoys underwater levels in any game. Jet ski levels, which are fun in a sense. Dogfighting levels, which essentially function like a really crappy version of an Ace Combat game. And you have the most successful of the three, which are racing levels. Now, the racing can be an enjoyable diversion, and I mean, the next game Naughty Dog made was a kart racer after all. But the other three are just off the mark in a lot of respects. The dogfighting lacks any real depth of any kind, and it's a chore to do in virtually every sense. I remember thinking that the dogfighting was kind of neat when I was a kid, but even then I didn't want to replay those levels. And this is one of the aspects of the entire trilogy that holds up least well overall. The water levels are at least close to being platforming levels, I guess, both the jet skiing and underwater, but ultimately the floaty controls, slow sort of pace, and generally frustrating nature of them just doesn't bear fruit. I very much respect that Naughty Dog took risks with these mechanics and systems, and I think it's a quality lacking in developers today for a whole host of reasons. But these levels are not exclusive to the Insane trilogy. They were also a part of the original. There is an issue that was not a part of the original, though, and that issue is...
One of the most common criticisms of this Crash Bandicoot re-release is that it doesn't feel quite right, and I can say for absolutely certain that this issue is not just in everyone's head. So, when developing the Insane trilogy, the design team had to decide, do we keep the physics, hang time of jumps, distance of jumps, and so on the way it was in each original game respectively, individually, and risk confusing players as to why Crash handles slightly differently from game to game, or should we pick one game's physics and try to apply it across the board to keep things consistent? The choice they ended up making should be pretty obvious, but in case it's not, the team chose the latter option and essentially applied the physics of Crash 3 to all three games. The problem with this is that Crash 3 has its standard jump distance slightly handicapped, meaning that the jump distance and hang time for a single jump is lower than in either of the previous Crash games. The reason for this being that Crash 3 awards the player a double jump later in the game after a boss fight. Now, the difference this shorter jump makes is minimal, but ultimately is significant enough that it ups the difficulty in the first two games, Crash 1 especially, by a noticeable amount. When you add to that the fact that surface edges are now rounded, meaning the player will slide off a surface if they land on the edge of it, and you have a recipe for frustration. The end result is that this universal application of physics across the games has a knock-on effect that increases the difficulty of the first two games. This increase in difficulty isn't actually all bad, but it does do more bad than good. There is one other Insane trilogy change though that is much more successful. So, not all the changes done to the games are for the worse. The Insane trilogy adds a number of little tweaks that actually have a significant positive effect on the game's replay value and general appeal. First and most significant of these changes is the addition of time trials to every level in Crash 1 and 2, where previously these were only available in Crash 3. On top of this, the time trials across all three games now contain online leaderboards, and that might seem like a small thing, but the beauty of this is that this offers a globally visible window into the capabilities of the speedrunning community that exists around the Crash games. This communicates to a player, even if they don't actually see a speedrun through a level, exactly what is possible with perfect pathing and technique, and also adds a reason to play back through and try to master any and every level across the trilogy, with gold and platinum relics being a genuinely challenging enough pursuit that receiving one of these relics is truly gratifying. What's more, upon completion of Crash 2 and 3, a player receives the speed boots, which increases the player's running speed while holding in the trigger by a significant amount. This was done to make speedrunning a more accessible pursuit, as in the original version of Crash Bandicoot 2, there was a speedrunning technique called the neutral slide spin that allowed players utilizing this technique to move a considerable amount faster. It is, however, incredibly unwieldy and really difficult to pull off consistently. I may be able to do it once, but I cannot do it consistently, and trust me, I have tried. This addition allows the average player to experience that same boost in speed that only expert speedrunners used to be able to achieve, while also allowing those same speedrunners to have back some of that cognitive space in their head that's being used up by having to constantly be executing this difficult and unwieldy maneuver, which in turn lets them turn their attention to more efficient pathing and more perfect timing and so on. There's another change, however, that is purely cosmetic, but welcome just the same. The player can now play as Coco in virtually every level in all three games. The visual variety this adds is pretty neat, even if it's inconsequential, but we've broken down the game enough, I think, so let's move on to the fun part. The key to fixing the Insane trilogy, and I guess by extension the games that make up the trilogy, lies in the details. The first order of business, I guess, is addressing the physics and the difficulty issues that come with this collection. Now, this isn't quite as simple as you might expect, because I actually believe that the increased difficulty has its place and has its merits. So what I would do is modify Crash himself's physics to be those of Crash in each of the original games, including the removal of rounded edges on surfaces, and the shrinking of certain item and enemy hitboxes, such as the vulture enemies in the first few levels of Crash 2, for instance. Coco, on the other hand, would keep all of the physics exactly as they are, including the rounded edges and larger hitboxes. This would allow a player to choose whether they want to experience the most faithful possible experience, or the most challenging one. I'd also implement additional playable characters eventually, which would be unlocked by beating them in the story mode, or in the case of good characters, by completing specific tasks, I guess. This would give achievements some added weight, and would add a ton of motivation for a player to do things like collect gems and complete time trials. Each character would have their own little stat differences to allow for a slightly different feel as well, further adding to the replay value of an already highly replayable game. For instance, you could play as Aku Aku by completing the game and gathering all the colored gems or some task of that nature, and Aku Aku would, say, be able to float over pits, thus making fall deaths impossible, but he'd be unable to gather mask boxes as he is the mask, meaning he will never be allowed a damage shield. This extends to other possible examples like being able to play as Cortex, who would have an overall lower jump height because of his stubby little legs, but the addition of a homing ranged attack in place of the spin, which would allow a clever runner to hit hard to reach boxes quickly and without danger, but require near perfect timing and spacing to jump across large gaps. They would each have their own vehicle ideally as well for the auto-scrolling levels, Cortex on his little weird hoverboard, and Aku gliding via magic or unicorn farts or whatever it is that powers him, and so on, just to increase the visual variety. These same ideas could be applied across Crash's entire rogues gallery, and would make for pretty stellar DLC, I think, allowing the player to experience the same game in completely different ways, without having to actually change any of the level design. Each of these characters would also have their own relic times and leaderboards to increase the amount of content and replay value of the games without taking away from anything in the core design or damaging the game's faithfulness to the originals. This would also help make up for some of the space that's wasted by the least engaging of the gimmick levels across the games, as the additional ways to play would grant all the standard levels a really new degree of dimension. The abilities of additional characters could even be used as a means to hide and unlock new secret areas that could be hidden in the original levels, adding new content and adding a whole new possibility space for veteran players that are just hungry for something new. But I guess I've taken up enough of your time, so let's wrap this thing up. So we all know at the end of the day, Crash is not a perfect game. Not Crash 1, or 2, or 3, and there's nothing controversial about saying a 20-year-old set of games has some problems. What is pretty staggering, though, is just how much better something like the Insane Trilogy holds up at times versus something brand new like Yooka-Laylee. I think the answer as to why lays in the linear design and accessible nature of the games, but regardless, it's easy to see that there's still potential here, within this 20-year-old framework, to make something that doesn't just evoke nostalgia, but that could create nostalgia for a new generation of players. We mostly discussed fixing the Insane Trilogy, but I think there's also some answers here as to how to bring the whole series forward into the present and make it an active part of gaming in the future. There's a lot of talk, especially lately, about whether or not mascot platformers, or even 3D platformers in general, have a place in the gaming landscape going forward, and I hope in this series we have definitively answered that question. At least I believe we have. Now, whether the future of the 3D platformer lies in mascot nostalgia, or first-person parkour, or unadulterated retro mechanics, I don't think there is one answer. I think the potential is there in all these approaches with a little bit of self-awareness and talent on behalf of developers. There is potential in mascot platformers if there's an effort on behalf of designers to look ahead at how to improve old systems, rather than only looking back on what used to be standard. I think there's potential in first-person platformers if designers can trust their core gameplay to carry the game on its own merit, instead of trying to turn their platformer into something else that it's not. And I think there is potential in simple retro mechanics if designers can just harness the ambition to expand the scope outward and offer players new ways to experience these old mechanics. Ultimately, nothing is certain, but I can tell you that to my mind, 3D platformers are here to stay.
And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. This was a really hard video to complete, and this was a really hard series to complete, a really hard series to even conceive of, honestly. This has been months and months in the making, so I'm glad I finally got to get it out there and get it done. But also I just wanted to bring back around the fact that I do now have a Patreon.
So if anybody would like to help me out with that, I would really appreciate it, but it is by no means required for me to continue making content. There will be some extras and such that will be included with that, along with, direct conversations with me and that sort of thing, if that interests you, I guess. I don't know why you'd want to talk to me. I don't even want to talk to me, but, whatever. So yeah, that's all down in the description, or I'll be putting it up here on the screen. So thank you again for watching. I know I say thank you so much, but I really do appreciate it, and I do feel the need to remind everybody how much I appreciate it. So thank you guys. I hope you all have an awesome day, and thanks again.